Making It Safer, a study of law enforcement fatalities between 2010 and 2016, brought to you by COPS, Community-Oriented Policing Services of the U.S. Department of Justice, and the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. This study analyzed 1,016 line-of-duty deaths between the years of 2010 and 2016. These deaths were then sorted by the type of activity, being call for service or self-initiated activity-based. In reviewing more recent data, these findings are consistent through 2020. Please note, the numbers we're referring to are only related to fatalities. When we account for officer injuries during these types of law enforcement activities, the numbers of incidents skyrocket. This study identified the top 5 police activities that resulted in officer fatalities. The number 1 activity was driving on patrol. The number 2 activity that resulted in officer fatalities was handling domestic violence-related calls for service. The number 3 activity for officer fatalities was conducting traffic stops. The number 4 officer activity leading to fatalities was handling disturbance calls for service. And the number 5 activity that led to officer fatalities was self-initiating check vehicles and check subjects. Let's discuss the number 1 cause of officer fatalities in more detail: our own driving on patrol. Yes, as crazy as it sounds, our own driving is still the number 1 killer of officers and has been for several years. Typically, these are our own fault for driving beyond our own abilities or those of our vehicle. The most common call for service when driving fatalities occur are officer needs assistance calls. Let's remember, the most important thing is that we actually get there so we can give the assistance they're calling for. If we get in an accident on the way there, all we're doing is creating more of a problem than there was to begin with. Here's some driving on patrol advice to make sure you arrive alive. Just like Below 100 taught us, wear your seatbelt, slow down, drive with due regard for public safety, and lastly, know your own driving abilities. The number 2 cause for officer fatalities was handling domestic violence-related calls for service. DV calls for service account for approximately 30% of all call for service-related officer fatalities. The majority of the officers were killed on their approach to the target location. The average distance of attacks was 50 feet from the front door. Most of these officers did not wait for backup before approaching the target location. So, how do we handle DV calls for service safer? Here's the DV call for service response advice given to us by this study. Come in quietly and park in a location not in direct line of sight of the target location. Be aware of call history and suspect description prior to arrival. This will help with mental preparation and planning as you arrive at your parking location. Wait for your backup unless extreme exigency exists. We never want to approach a DV call on our own. Remember, DV calls don't just mean family fights. DV calls include custody issues, serving or enforcing orders of protection, or civil standbys. Waiting for backup on all DV-related calls for service is extremely important. After arriving, be sure to approach in a manner that utilizes concealment and be aware of available cover if needed. Prior to contact, stop, look, and listen to gather as much information as possible. Be purposeful in where you stand, both before and after knocking on the door. The number 3 cause of officer fatalities is conducting traffic stops. We all know that traffic stops are anything but routine and are inherently dangerous. But did you know that traffic stops account for 52% of all self-initiated activity officer fatalities? When do attacks on traffic stops occur? The study broke down 5 different time periods. Prior to contact or immediate attack upon stopping, 21% officer fatalities occurred. During initial contact with the driver, 49% of officer fatalities occurred. During an arrest attempt, 22% of officer fatalities occurred. After being arrested, 5% of officer fatalities occurred. And lastly, death caused by a third party that was unrelated to the traffic stop came in at 3% of officer fatalities related to traffic stops. Here's the advice given to us by this study to make traffic stops safer. Call out stops with specific stop location information. Don't just say, I'm at Hayden and Cholla. Instead, say something like, I'm at 11,500 North Hayden Road in the Starfire Golf Country Club parking lot. That more specific information can be the seconds needed for someone else to find you if you get into trouble. Predict and control when and where your traffic stop occurs. Activate your lights at the right timing to influence the other vehicle into pulling into the location you desire. Utilize passenger side approaches more often. Force Science Institute has shown them to be much safer. Watch this quick video from Lexipol to tell you a little bit more about passenger side approaches.
Gordon Graham here with today's tip from Lexipol. And today's tip, once again, is for my cop friends, and it deals with traffic stops, specifically passenger side vehicle approaches. Here's a thought for you. Traffic stops are one of the most common tasks patrol officers perform, and they quickly become dangerous, and they should never, never, never become routine. Remember, complacency kills. Many officers consider the passenger side approach a safer technique. These approaches can be highly effective and reduce some risks. It can provide an element of surprise and added safety. Many drivers expect an officer to approach the driver's side window, but don't allow this to create a false sense of safety. The passenger side approach can reduce some traffic concerns by moving you away from traffic lanes. This approach allows you to be a bit more focused on what's going inside the vehicle. This approach can also provide increased protection, allowing us to look inside the vehicle. This creates a better opportunity to see the occupants in their hands while noticing any potential threats. Proper positioning also makes you more difficult to target. You will have more time to respond should things go bad. There are many advantages to the passenger side approach, but it's not perfect. Visual observation of the driver is reduced while walking behind your vehicle for the approach. Like everything, training and practice are important. Increase your knowledge by getting inside a vehicle to get the occupant's perspective from different seating positions. Practice the approach in daylight and in darkness. You know, this is my 40th year and going around America giving talks to law enforcement people. And I went through some of my old training materials from the early 80s. And I had material then on traffic stops and safe approaches. One of the things I used to say was this: give me a PhD in my patrol car on a ride along. Hey doctor, you got a PhD? I do. In risk management. Hey doctor, I'm making a traffic stop up here. Would I be better off walking up on the left-hand side of the car or the right-hand side of the car? Well, Mr. Graham, I am a risk manager, but I've never studied the accumulated data of cops on traffic stops. Well, I have. Here's 80 years of data. On a left side approach, you have no cover, no concealment, and passing traffic. On a right side approach, you've got some cover, some concealment, and no passing traffic. Right side approaches. One last thought. In this 40 years that I've been doing this, I get nice messages from people. In the old days, phone calls, today emails. I got an email 2 years ago from a fellow who was in a DUI class that I taught back in the 90s. Dear Mr. Graham, I am writing this to you because I can. In the early 90s, I was in a DUI class and you talked about right side approaches. I never thought about it, so I started making right side approaches because what you said made sense. I'm 1 year away from retirement. Yesterday, I made an approach on a vehicle. I was standing on the right-hand side. A vehicle came off the roadway, wiped out the entire left-hand side of my patrol car. The entire left-hand side of the car I had stopped. Had I been there, I wouldn't be able to write you this email. I am writing this email to you because I can. Right side approaches, folks. And that is today's tip from Lexipol. Gordon Graham signing off.
Here's some additional advice for making traffic stops safer. Be sure to back up your fellow officers on traffic stops. Short of a public safety hazard, we should never be driving by our fellow officers and leaving them alone on a traffic stop. And while you're at it, be a good backup and stay near the violator vehicle with a clear view of the occupants. This will make both you and the stopping officer safer. The number 4 police activity that led to officer fatalities was handling disturbance calls for service. There are many types of calls for service that are considered disturbances. These calls for service were deemed to initially be nonviolent, nuisance crimes, or complaints such as drinking in public, indecent exposure, disorderly conduct, or trespassing. Disturbance calls for service typically account for 15 to 20% of all call for service related officer fatalities. Most of these calls for service start with very limited information and can escalate very quickly. Attempting to handle these without backup was another unfortunate trend that was found with these types of calls for service. Here's some advice for making responding to disturbance calls for service a little safer. Know the suspect description. This will allow more time for decision making, calling for backup, and choosing your approach. When located, absent exigent circumstance, observe while waiting for backup and coordinate your approach together with your other officer. Approach cautiously and utilize tactics that build in discretionary time, maintaining distance, utilizing physical barriers, approaching with concealment, noting your close cover if needed. All of these build in discretionary time that will afford you more time for decision making should the situation go awry. The number 5 police activity leading to officer fatalities was self-initiating checked vehicles and checked subjects. Conducting checked vehicles and checked subjects accounted for 36% of all self-initiated activity officer fatalities. Over 50% of these deaths involved an officer making initial contact by themselves. Most of these officers were killed in the middle of their interactions, not upon initial contact. The primary contributing factor in the offender's decision to attack at this time was their fear of discovery. Discovery of their current crime, discovery of their warrant, discovery of their true identity. It's this fear that instigated the attack during these encounters. Based on the findings of this study, here is some advice for conducting safer checked vehicles and checked subjects. Absent exigent circumstances, observe while waiting for backup to arrive and then coordinate your approach together with your other officer. Approach cautiously and utilize tactics that build in that discretionary time we've previously spoken of. Maintain a high level of situational awareness when running subjects via radio or MDC. When approaching, always be predicting the possibility of the suspicious person or vehicle fleeing. Understand your legal authority and policy related to these actions. This study summary is not meant to be condescending or belittling of the officers that gave their lives doing this noble profession. It is an opportunity to learn from them and improve ourselves in order to do our part in reducing the number of officer fatalities that occur annually. None of this information is earth-shattering. However, even with the knowledge that our own driving, handling domestic violence-related calls for service, and conducting traffic stops are 3 of the most dangerous police activities we do on a regular basis, they consistently remain at the top of this list. The suggestions for making these types of activities safer may seem basic, but it is our continued violations of these basic tenets of police work that put us in the most danger. We, as law enforcement officers, need to hold ourselves and our partners accountable for doing this job in the safest manner possible. Thank you for watching, stay safe, and take care of each other.